Brent. It's now the turn of Domenico Coiro, who's a full professor at the Department of Industrial Engineering Aerospace Division at the University of Naples Federico II in Italy. And I will just a moment, I will share the presentation. So we are ready to start again. It's now the turn for another in-person participant, and we have Danielle Preziuso from the PNNL, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in the US, and she's a Socio-Technical system engineer and distributed wind portfolio lead. Please come here, and I will take her. And welcome, first. Have it also here.
Should have worn my glasses. Okay, yeah, so I'm Danielle Preziuso. I do lead Pacific Northwest National Laboratory's distributed wind portfolio. And so today I'll share some work that was led by Jacob Garby that I advised on, and a great team behind this work as well. So want to make sure that I acknowledge those folks here too. I think over the past day or so, we've heard a lot about different experiences from the industry. So what we were trying to do with this piece of research as a national lab was to try to aggregate that in some way that could be documented and communicated. So we took on some installer perspectives in this piece of work. Deployment for distributed wind energy technologies, whether they are small or they are large, are pretty well known and documented. So we hear barriers to deployment kind of covered in broad strokes, right? So we'll hear things like complex interconnection standards or processes, high costs that sort of encourage or promote people choosing solar instead. There's uncertain, particularly historically, uncertain policy environments. Sometimes people don't know that smaller distributed wind is an option for them. And then in the United States, we often have conflicting siting policies, or sometimes they are even in tension with one another. And so we use these big picture ideas and framing to talk about those deployment barriers. But what we know is that the way that those barriers manifest for the individuals doing the work looks a little bit different, right? And it happens at different stages. It happens at different stages in the deployment process, whether it's for the installers, for a farmer who is interested in owning that system, or different types of businesses that are involved along the way. So how do we take those bigger terms, those broad strokes, and paint a more detailed picture so that we understand when and how those barriers actually manifest, so that we can tailor the solutions that we offer, the research that we do in more informed ways. So what we did here, I'll keep going, just words up there. So what we did here was we leveraged a human-centered design method called journey mapping. And journey mapping tries to chronologically trace processes from the perspective of individuals or organizations that participate in them. So of course, processes are not linear as much as we would like it to be a clear path forward. We know it's a little bit wavy. We know things circle back and iterate at times. But what we did for this piece of work was try to create a little bit of a structure around that process, the deployment process. So just for the sake of function, we looked at customer outreach, siting, permitting and interconnection, construction and installation, and then finally operation and maintenance of those small and distributed wind turbines. And we did this specifically from an installer and developer perspective. So the first action that we took within this work, Lindsay presented on the distributed wind market report yesterday. We leveraged that avenue to reach out to known installers in the United States. So we had 18 installers that we were able to send emails to. of which we got 6 replies. So not a huge sample size here, but a good opportunity to look at shared experiences across that set, knowing that there were only 18 that we could actively send information to and solicit in the first place. And so along with that outreach, we sent a pre-interview survey asking them to rank different deployment barriers. So using those structural categories on the last slide and asking them, during this phase of deployment, how often are you experiencing challenges to making the project successful? So our 6 installers that responded, everyone filled out the survey, and we had a range of experience here. We had installers from 8 through 42 years of experience, and they spanned the United States. So coast to coast, California to New York, we had some representation there. And we also saw that these installers worked with different size machines. So from the micro scale up to 2.5 megawatts is sort of what these installers and developers are working with. So a diversity of turbine sizes and application types. So in that pre-interview survey, we saw a handful of different things come up. I think one of the takeaways that we had was during the installation phase, people weren't actually experiencing too many challenges that they couldn't overcome. And I think that really spoke to the expertise of those individuals, right? That's where they're thriving here. Where we saw more frequent reports of challenges or barriers was in the siting and permitting processes. So pretty much across the board there, with the exception of 1 or 2 outliers, we're seeing high numbers or high frequency of pain points during those times. So with that information from that survey, we conducted semi-structured interviews with those 6 installers. So again, using those 5 categories to structure those interviews. With semi-structured interviews, we were able to develop a predetermined set of questions to guide that interview, but then give ourselves some flexibility to actually respond in live time and direct the conversation in ways that were relevant to that individual. So each call was about 30 to 60 minutes, depending on folks' interest. Those were conducted virtually on Teams. So we would have the installer on that call, as well as the interviewer and someone taking notes as well. And then we used a transcription function that was built in with Teams to make sure we were documenting that communication as well. So what we did with that interview is we coded those interviews to try to better understand the pain point frequencies. So we used a best fit framework, both inductive and deductive categories. So we had, I think it was 9 deductive categories based on previous distributed wind work under this project. But we were just sort of hearing some of these repeated challenges come up. So we were able to populate those within the framework before we actually did the interviews. And then we had some inductive categories that came to light by reviewing the interviews. So things that we maybe hadn't anticipated hearing, but did come up within those discussions. And so I think one of the things that we know very well is that there are varying local ordinances, and that's really playing into some of those higher frequency pain points, like permitting issues and challenges with public knowledge. A couple things that we didn't expect to hear. Of course, we know there's an educational gap at times when it comes to distributed wind, but hostile government interactions with those local governments came up a little bit more than we had anticipated. And it seemed to be a link between hostility and the level of education or understanding around the technology and what folks were believing. And that also plays into the negative public perception, right? When we're at the local level, our public perception is often more directly reflected through those local policies rather than when we're at a federal scale. So when we looked across our deployment stages here and we tallied how many times those pain points came up in our 5 different parts of the deployment process, It was very clear that things were aligning with the pre-interview survey, that permitting and interconnection is really a challenge, right? So they're varied by location, by municipality. And from an installer perspective, it makes it very challenging to implement processes that can be easily replicated, right? When we're trying to scale deployment up, if we can't do the same thing and we're having to tailor what we submit during that stage of deployment, we're going to continue to face challenges in actually increasing the number of turbines that we have installed. So again, construction and installation, that's what this group of folks is doing best. When those challenges do come up, they're able to solve them. So with all of that information from our interviews, what we wanted to do was create that journey map, right? What does it look like from start to finish from an installer perspective? Recognizing that this is not a representative installer, the sample size is small, but can we look at shared experiences so that we can better communicate around these pain points and barriers? So what we did, we had a little internal workshop to look at the interviews that we coded. And try to identify where there were some shared behaviors, some shared traits, characteristics of the individuals or organizations that were actually speaking with us. So two things came very clear from that workshop of analysis. We developed these personas. The first one is the seeker persona. And so there was this trend arising in conversation with some of the installers, where they were very actively going out to get their customers, right? They're going to trade shows. They are reaching out to potential customers in locations that they know have good wind resources. And it's a little bit of convincing them, right? Selling them on the technology, saying, hey, this could work well for you. Here are some benefits. So that was kind of one persona that came up through those interviews. The second persona that came out of that analysis was the responder. So we started to see this trend where some of the folks who had been in the industry longer, they were not going out and doing more advertisement. There's a shortage of service providers for this size turbine in the United States. So these folks were just getting direct inquiries, right? People are reaching out to them and saying, hey, my neighbor has a small turbine. I'm interested. What would it look like for me? Or, hey, the person who installed this is out of business. Can you come help with maintenance of this machine? And so sometimes the responders, those relationships with customers would be a little short-lived. In cases where the wind resource maybe isn't actually a good idea for them. So a little bit of the flip side to what we were seeing from the seeker persona. And so we use these personas to track the journeys over time for deployment. So this is a little small, I can recognize that here. But what you can see, so along the bottom part there, we have our 5 structural categories, again, from customer outreach and acquisition through to operation and maintenance. And so those green tan boxes that are in the middle of that diagram there, those are kind of the steps in each of those categories that people were referring back to. And the pink boxes were the actions or activities that needed to happen. We have, they're quite small, but the blue circles are showing the seeker persona and the purple ones show the responder persona. And so you see divergent paths in the process from these two personas in the early stages, right? Based on how they are getting their customers. So we see that our seeker persona is attending events, sending out those mailers. And then our responder is getting recommendations from word of mouth or just information that's already out on their website. And you can see that few pain points are actually flagged in that process, right? So even though they're taking different approaches to getting customers, they sort of see that, hey, this is functioning okay right now. But as you continue to move on, you see that increase in yellow warning sign labels there. So you see that particularly as you move further down, in that permitting and interconnection category, there are more categorical steps that folks need to do during that stage. So part of that comes from zoning approvals, interconnection applications, other types of permits that are at the local level. And you can sort of see how those thin dotted lines are going back to actions and activities that are linked to local government approvals as well as local utilities. So there's really this connection point between local actors, whether they're neighbors, whether they're in the government, and that portion of the deployment process, indicating that some of the support or research that we do in the future could be well targeted at that stage to help alleviate some of those pain points. So key takeaways from this piece of work was really just to put all of this together, right? A lot of you shared these lived experiences in your talks over the past 2 days. But how do we make sure that that information is accessible to others and show the impact that it has on our ability to collectively increase deployment of small and distributed wind? So most of the pain points are coming up during that permitting stage. The pain points, which do have overlaps with some of those barriers on a sweeping scale, include permitting issues, largely because they're so diverse, it's challenging to actually pinpoint them. Then again, lack of public knowledge, probably no surprise to you all. And then finally, an underdeveloped market. So again, that access to actually having installers nearby and those interactions that go back and forth. So the two personas that we identified were the seeker and the responder, which really took place in the customer acquisition phase. And then finally, we'd like to take some next steps with this work. So given the small sample size and the single perspective that our journey map has, our next goal is to try to interview some end use customers. What does this journey look like from their perspective? And can we create a journey map along the same chronological path and overlap those to try to see where there are similarities, where there are differences? Are there shared pain points? Are there different ways that we should be looking at the work that we do to offer assistance in the deployment space? And in doing so, we also decrease the subjectivity of those maps as well. We have done a little bit of customer outreach. It's been very difficult to find folks who are willing to talk about this. So it's also inspired another piece of work of trying to elevate distributed wind success stories. If we want to increase deployment, we think that it is very critical that we can let people, potential customers, see themselves in this opportunity space. So how do we lift up those voices and make them accessible? And so we're playing around with this idea of distributed wind ambassadors who can share their stories and making sure that they are part of this solution. So that's all I have for you today. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So there was a comment I could see. Thumbs up for Pacific Northwest wants to become a distributed wind ambassador.
Love it.
So I guess it's an appreciated approach.
I'll take it.
Any question from the audience? No. It's late afternoon.
I was supposed to say, I'm just, no one fell asleep, so I'll take it as a win.
And remember, all this at the end it's recorded, so it's the potential. It's huge. So thanks a lot.